left off to the side, um, the more facets we add to a project, the more need for upkeep there will be of those different facets, and the more cumbersome it can be. So let's not move into a multi-benefit paradigm where we create more of a burden for ourselves. Let's figure out how to do it in a smart way. And then, you know, that integration, let's figure out how to be consistent across agencies. To the extent that we can do that from the vantage of any one perspective, to the extent that the board can do that, from you all's vantage. So those are sort of my quick summary of the strategies that the advisory committee put forward. And there were some specific recommendations around those. One of them, or two of them, related to measurable objectives, and basically that they really be used to guide integration across the landscape in the way that we talked about. So let's use those objectives in the conservation strategy to understand how regional scale conservation objectives combine to address basin scale conservation objectives, combine to address system scale conservation objectives. Um, Funding, we're going to, some of my colleagues will dig into specific funding recommendations more deeply, but basically we said we need more funding for multi-benefit projects and all of their components. Um, we had a number of recommendations around permitting, programmatic permitting, um, permitting that addresses O&M, um, reduce the permitting burden for multi-benefit projects, and assemble case studies that speak to, as an interim step, permitting successes and ways to kind of make that process run more smoothly, short of the overhaul, which I think there was widespread agreement is needed in some way at some point, but probably isn't realistic to happen all at once. The coordination I've mentioned a couple times, and I think there was a suggestion that the tracking that comes after it could actually facilitate that. So if you had coordination that happened at the permitting level, you had a common set of objectives that were being managed across the landscape, you could then have transparency around what was required from the different regulatory processes and figure out a way to bring them into alignment and coordinate better with the details of those regulatory processes, and that coordination needed to be supported by just more communication among the agencies that work on issues having to do with critters and the environment within the flood system. And then there are some very specific recommendations for tracking, the development of a tool, a process for tracking, that the board do some of that tracking, and that the tracking be done relative to the measurable objectives in the conservation strategy and relative to objectives for flood management and flood safety, so that we know how we're doing, sort of using those objectives as performance measures for projects that come forward and then also for the system as a whole. So I went through this list and I kind of just did like a super basic color coding. This is my anecdotal color key, where I just said, how are we doing? And it's only been 2 years, so this list was all red when we started. So any progress from that is great. But it's also, I think, a good indicator of kind of like where we could double down our efforts as we think about moving forward in the context of this new administration. So in the measurable objectives and applying them to management across the landscape, I think we're still in the pretty early stages of doing that. Those objectives are out there. We have things like the new RCIS process that invite mitigation being organized around regional conservation plans. And in some cases, those regional conservation planning efforts have been aligned with the flood regions and with the conservation strategy measurable objectives. But in a bunch of cases, we haven't gotten there yet, or they're aligned around something else. So I think there's still a big opportunity there to really use those objectives for one of the purposes they were laid out for, which is to organize our kind of landscape scale strategy for conservation. In terms of funding, we have succeeded collectively in bringing a bunch more funding for multi-benefit projects specifically, and that is great news. And it's being spent, and things are happening, and and that's definitely something to celebrate. And it's going to take a lot more in order to do all the things on that list, and that's a need that never goes away. So it's easy to kind of to not give it its due, but it's also something that we really need to be vigilant around if we want to successfully execute this transition to a new way of doing business. Permitting, you can see there's a lot of red and orange there. I think the good news there, from my vantage, is we've had a lot of great discussions around permitting, and there have been some specific real wins in that area. The development of some programmatic permitting related more to federal permits, I think has has opened the door for a bigger discussion around programmatic permitting. But in general, in the permitting space, we still have a big need to both think about how we do more integrated permitting and to come up with some examples of things that are working in the permitting world so that we can apply them more widely. Coordination is sort of similar. It's happening in specific places, but not broadly. And then tracking, one of the areas where there's been the most progress, there is a tracking tool, and that's awesome. And figuring out how to use it, how to incorporate it into the permitting process, and then also establishing a baseline so that we're using the tracking tool not to just collect information on new projects, but to actually understand how the net condition of the landscape is changing positively or negatively with impacts, with mitigation, and with new projects, I think is sort of the next step in the tracking tools application. So I just leave you with that. I appreciate the time. That's sort of my sense of where we are. For myself, in terms of my work with you, I sort of see this as my work plan for support and advocacy. And so I just wanted to offer it to kind of, give you a heads up that these are the things that I'm hoping to reach out and continue to collaborate on. And yeah, I really appreciate the cooperation through time and look forward to more. Thank you.
Thank you for your input and your comments. You and other members of the advisory committee have been strong participants in this process of creating a plan that really can take us to the future and address all the needs. So appreciate that. I see someone arrived. Are you
Hello?
good?
Yes, I just wanted to announce Ellen Hannock from the Public Policy Institute of California is here. So we're going to squeeze her in before the next speaker comes up. And Ellen Hannock.
Please, huh?
Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for the invitation to join you. We're going to pass out one handout, which is a report that I'm going to kind of draw from in my comments. And I don't want you to be discouraged by the fact that the title of the report is Managing Drought in a Changing Climate, because really floods are kind of the flip side of that. And so a lot of what we did in this work is super relevant for thinking about the flood side of the piece and how to really think about them and managing those in an integrated way. So,
Could I just get you to speak your name for the record, please?
yes,
Thank
it's
you.
Ellen Hannock, and I am the director of the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. So, just about ready to kick off. And what I'm going to talk to you about is some findings from an effort that we led involving about 30 colleagues from around the state. It was a multi-year study looking at lessons from the latest drought, and we wanted to sort of look at that, take the latest drought as an example of kind of future droughts that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And as we looked at that, we looked at kind of how the changing climate is going to add to the challenges and what reforms are needed. And a really key part of this analysis was how the changing climate is going to be impacting not only drought situations, but also this flip side of floods, because a key issue that we're going to be facing as we go forward is managing increased variability and some changes in patterns of runoff that are really important for how we manage water supply and flood management in an interconnected way. And I think a lot of my takeaways are going to be very relevant for what you just heard from Renee and what you're going to hear from other folks that are going to come after me. So this is just a chart to show you sort of recent history of California's precipitation. That's the top line, and then temperature is the bottom line. These are statewide averages, and it's deviations from the mean. And what you see highlighted there on the top is that we've got variable precipitation. I mean, that's kind of a fact of life. The latest drought was a bad one from a precipitation perspective, but what really aggravated it was the temperature perspective, which is the bottom line. And you can see there that we've been getting hotter. And so we had the 2 record hottest years, at least up until that time, during the drought, at the height of the drought. And then another characteristic just to highlight is that this record drought was followed by very wet year, near record, in some places record in the Sacramento Valley. And that was also a warm year by historical standards. And so we're starting to see these characteristics of a changing climate now that the models have been predicting, and now the data that we're living are actually showing this. So as part of this work, we teamed up with some climate scientists to look at kind of projecting this future drought, this drought and the very wet year that we just experienced into the future, so into the 40s, kind of the planning horizon for a lot of water management projects. And we also brought in Daniel Swain. Dr. Swain was at UCLA, now has a joint position with NCAR in Boulder and UCLA. And he and his team had just been coming out with new research on some of the characteristics of the way the climate is expected to be changing as well. So I'm just going to summarize for you 5 key pressures that are already impacting California's water system, that are going to be increasing in the future, and give you some flavor of what the team kind of came to for implications for how to think about managing this as a water system. So first is warming temperatures. Second, which is related to that, is shrinking snowpack. Either the models predict average kind of converge at no change in average precipitation levels, definitely a shift in the percentage of snow relative to rain. Shorter wet seasons, this is the idea of the changing seasonality. I'll show you a graph for that in a minute. More volatile precipitation from year to year, so more spikier than that upper graph that I showed you of our rainfall trends. And then rising seas, which impact obviously flooding in some places, but also water supply. So warming, this map just shows you projecting out to the future drought that, kind of reproducing the drought we just had, but going out to the early 40s. That's, kind of what it looks like. Everywhere is predicted to be warmer, quite a bit warmer in some places. These temperature impacts have effects on water demand, and therefore kind of amp up the pressure to think about supply management. And they also are causing this shift in between rain and snow in our total how we get the precipitation and how we get to store it. As you know, the snowpack is a key part of our water storage system right now. This map shows just, it's one of many that have been created over the last decade or 15 years, projecting out, because of just temperature, what is expected to happen to snow water equivalent in the Sierra, which is now accounts for typically about a third of the storage that we have, and it has been very conveniently melting in the past at the time when summer irrigation demands are getting higher, so it's kind of a nice convenient system. What's going to be happening is the shift in the timing of runoff as, more of this precipitation is just going to fall as rain, and then the precip that does fall as snow is melting sooner because of the high temperatures. So this is going to increase trade-offs between flood management and management for water supply in our multipurpose reservoirs. Because you guys and ladies want to have enough space in those reservoirs to keep people safe downstream, but on the water user side, folks want to have enough for their urban and agricultural needs, and there are also really important issues with respect to keeping water in reservoirs for ecosystems as well during the drier months. So, this is also going to mean more water potentially available to store underground, because that's one of the ways to kind of think about managing the system is getting more water underground. That's relevant for thinking about some of these multi-purpose projects that the rest of the folks this morning are talking to you about. So third, seasonality is what the climate scientists talk about this. Basically, it's that just a change anticipated in the season of our wet season. So what this graph shows you is kind of the model projections. Well, both looking back, the gray bell curve is kind of the historical patterns of runoff, how much we get of our precipitation in those different months of our wet season, and that blue line is the predicted change out to mid-century. And what you see there is shaving off a bit on the edges, both on the sort of early part of the season and the late part of the season, and then a spikier winter. So this we're already seeing manifest in our fire seasons. The fact that the fall has tended to be drier just means that stuff is a lot more flammable later into the season, and this has been a big challenge already for California. Some of the recent big fall fires that we've had are, to some extent, a reflection made worse by this. But this again, also this spike in the winter means again thinking about some of these trade-offs with managing storage between the flood side and the water supply side. So. Fourth, precipitation from year to year is becoming more volatile. This is just, the idea that on average the models aren't projecting that California is going to get drier. That could happen, but on average the models are saying they don't see that, but they do see an increase in spikiness. So that if we're going to stay wet enough to, kind of maintain supplies, it's going to be with bigger storms and these bigger atmospheric rivers. And that, again, kind of adds to this sort of thinking about the runoff, managing runoff and how to do that from a flood perspective where you want to protect people and keep them out of harm's way, and from a supply perspective where you need to plan for these more severe droughts, drier droughts, hotter droughts, where demand, if anything, demand pressure, if anything, going to be higher. Yes, sir.
Could you please explain it?
Sure. What this is showing, and this is from research from Daniel Swain and his colleagues, is the change in frequency of the extreme wet and dry years. And I think I would have to look at the notes to the table, the figure that's in here, but I think it's like the top 25%, something like that. So just the idea that you're going to have basically more spiky years, more extreme years, both on the dry and on the wet side.
I still don't understand, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks. What this is also going to, again, kind of lead to this need to, both an increased demand for aquifer storage, because what we find is that by the third year of a bad drought, there's not a whole lot that our surface reservoirs can give us in terms of carryover storage for water supply. And so people want to go to the ground and pump more. So that's how we got through the last drought, was with a lot of extra pumping. Now that we have a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's going to be a need to manage that. People are still going to want to be able to pump more during droughts, but that means need to have more aquifer storage in advance of those things. But, this also, this variability also raises more uncertainties about the kind of investments that you want to put into storage and kind of thinking about the most cost-effective ways to do that.
Ask a question.
Yeah, happy to.
Our floods plan, our updated flood plan showed San Joaquin with climate change was going to produce flows that were unmanageable with the current flood system. And one of the problems is that the reservoirs, if you look at how they were designed, New Exchequer, New Don Pedro, and so on down the line, were designed based on controlling snowmelt floods. Rain floods really weren't an issue. So you can't really just increase flood space in those reservoirs because they don't have any outlet capacity. So there would have to be major investments in changing the ability to release water from those reservoirs if you're going to use them to control rain floods instead of snowmelt floods. They had adequate outlet capacity for snowmelt, but not for rain.
This is a really excellent point, and it ties into what I'm going to talk about a little bit as one of our key recommendations that I think is relevant statewide and especially for consideration by you all, but of thinking about how we're going to manage the grid in a more integrated way. And in the San Joaquin Valley, there is a lot of demand for recharge, and there's a lot of soils with good conditions for it. So, but we need to figure out kind of how to make that work at a system level to get more of that water into the ground, and figure out how to schedule that and so on. That's a really good
There's a lot
point.
of different implications in this whole thing. One thing, we had people in the San Joaquin Valley question our 2017 report as to the reliability of the projections we were using for climate change flows. But this information that you're providing here seems to support what our 2017 report was finding.
I think, there's a lot of convergence that one's starting to see between research done with different models and approaches on some of these basics. And, we are starting to see some of this now in what's happening out in the field too. So, I'll just, touch, the last one is relevant, sea level rise for thinking about flood management in coastal areas. Obviously, it's also it adds to water supply trade-offs with flood management because, there are some direct water supply threats from flooding in the delta, but then there are also just challenges to, sort of coastal aquifers and things that could increase the demand for surface water. So what we did in this work was we tried to kind of look, and we looked at lessons across sectors in terms of how they got through the drought and got out of it. And we came up with 4 areas of essential reforms. I'm only going to focus on 2 of them briefly for you here, but I don't want to not mention the other 2. So the first one is planning ahead. What we found is, in general, it really matters for sectors whether they've got a decent plan that they've anticipated. It doesn't mean you end up implementing everything exactly the way the plan says, but it helps a lot. And so I would say the 2017 plan that you all have is a very good example of trying to get out ahead of these things. The second is upgrading the water grid, and I'm going to show you a little bit more what I mean about that in a minute, but that's really our combined infrastructure, natural and hard infrastructure system for managing water. The third is updating water allocation rules, which is especially important for thinking about the drought side of things and ability to trade water, allocate water adequately to the environment, but it's relevant for recharge too because there are permitting issues related to getting that water out there. And then the fourth is finding money, which is important for you all to think about. So this great idea, this just is a sort of very high level schematic of kind of how we're thinking about it. The picture with the circles and the lines, squiggly lines, is the major surface reservoirs in the state, kind of scaled by size. And then the squiggles, if they're blue, they're rivers, and if they are other colors, they are some kind of aqueduct or canal. There is a lot more than that within regions and at the local level, but it just gives you an idea that we have already a pretty heavily engineered system. The map to the right is the map of groundwater, major groundwater basins in the state that are used by folks both in urban and agricultural uses. The big swaths of orange are the adjudicated basins, and then the rest are basins that are subject to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And the dark blue are the ones that are deemed critically overdrafted. What we're saying here is that California already does a certain amount of integrated management of its grid, obviously between flood and supply on the surface side. In some cases, there's conjunctive management between surface storage and groundwater storage, but we have to really amp this up. And we need to be thinking about upgrades to our system in a kind of integrated way that includes not just looking at any one sort of component of it, but really where are you going to get the most value in thinking about these changes in runoff patterns and the changes in demand patterns and the need to deal with sustainable groundwater management. Where's the best bang for the buck in terms of investments, and conveyance is likely to be an important one, I'll just say, and that relates, Mr. Countryman, to your point about thinking about the flood side of it. Some of the conveyance, my sense is, in the San Joaquin Valley is going to be about ability to get water out to the places that can take it in high water years. That's not going to solve every problem, but it's going to be important. Expanding natural flood infrastructure is another piece of this, and it ties in very well to the kind of multi-benefit approaches that you're hearing about from the other speakers. There's also just the whole piece of modernizing and integrating operations. So some of the kinds of things folks are looking at with forecast-informed flood reservoirs, sort of some of the, using advanced weather work to help manage some of these trade-offs is going to be really key. The find the money piece, here you go in looking at kind of where floods are in the scheme of what we spend on water. This is an estimate of annual water system spending for a few years in recent time, where we split it out between water supply, quality, floods, ecosystems, and then geobond debt service. You can see flood management is a relatively small piece of the puzzle. Water supply and water quality get a lot of funding from local ratepayers. Flood management does too, but there's a big gap there on the flood side, which you're well aware of, I think. And we highlight the flood area as well as a few other areas, including stormwater management and certain kinds of kind of multi-benefit innovative projects, and safe drinking water as some of the fiscal orphans that need to be addressed. So what we have kind of highlighted here is the importance of thinking about general obligation bonds for the kinds of things that are really hard to fund through ratepayers and local tax bases, and that does include these fiscal orphans. What this graph shows you is the general obligation bonds focused on water since the 70s, all converted to the same 2012 dollars, and that the 2010s have not been quite as generous in that respect as the 2000s were, in part because of the Prop 3 bond that did not pass in November of 2018, right? And that, I'll just highlight, did not have a whole lot of money for some of these fiscal orphans like floods. So thinking about this in the future, one's going to want to think about that. I'll just say that's not the only source for filling the gap, but it's important. And then finally, just to wrap up, and I think this ties in with kind of how we have to think about everything in the context of a resilience portfolio, but it's really important for the flood side of it and integrating floods with the supply side, is some principles around increasing flexibility to manage the variability that's increasing, developing incentives for folks to do things in ways that are going to be as effective as possible. And that includes not only from the state's perspective, providing financial incentives, but also regulatory, easing the regulatory burden in some cases of doing some of these things. Encouraging alignment across agency programs and requirements. That's very much in the spirit of kind of what we just heard about how to make it easier to do some of these multi-benefit projects. And the multi-benefit approaches are going to be not the only thing we're going to have to do, but we have to think about that where we can, because that's the way to get buy-in. And I'm just going to highlight for you here the Yola bypass as a great example of that kind of happened. We backed into a multi-benefit project back in the early 20th century by doing that, and now we can, learn a lot from that for other places. And then the bottom are a couple pictures from the Kern Water Bank, which is just an example of a really effective multi-benefit kind of recharge project for taking water in wet years. And that's all I've got for you. So thank you.
Thank you for your thoughtful presentation. Thank you for this. Sometimes slides need a little more dissertation to them, and this, I can see that revised this, plus I have your full report too.
Okay.
And the seminars you put on are amazing. If you invited all of us, we'd be able to come as well. So thank you.
Thanks
for
so much.
that. Mr. Countryman has more.
I'm very concerned about water supply, even forgetting climate change. Just looking at tree ring information tells us we can have a 12-year drought. So one of my questions, when you're doing these studies, what is the term, what dry period are you trying to address?
So it is true that we can have longer droughts. I mean, we have in the medieval period, we had much longer droughts at some times than we have in modern California. What we looked at in this study in particular was kind of stressing the system with the kinds of droughts that we've been experiencing, the sort of the worst droughts we've been experiencing, but with future climate conditions, acknowledging that if droughts continue a lot beyond that, we're going to face additional trade-offs and choices. We recommend for urban areas that they need to plan for longer droughts than that. And you look at a place like San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, they already plan for, I think, a 7.5 or 8 year drought and are looking at kind of even extending that outward. And a lot of the large important wholesalers are kind of thinking long in that regard. And what you think about in those contexts is what's your balance of your sort of resilient supply portfolio, but also what are the smart ways to manage demand over time.
That was my next question. Have you looked at demand modification?
Yes. And so that's going to be important in all sectors. That's why one of the strategies that we emphasize as very important is water trading too, because we use water for a lot of things in California, and there's a lot of variation in how costly it is to cut back in a drought. And so you see this already in agriculture. There was a big uptick in trading during this last drought to help keep trees alive, where farmers that had annual crops made their water available, and it was financially they were remunerated for that. So there are ways that we have to, when I talk about the sort of our third priority there of updating water allocation rules, part of it is making it easier to do that kind of trading. But there are some things that once we get into droughts that are longer and harder than what we've been experiencing, it is going to ultimately require bigger cutbacks in some ag acreage, for example. But I guess our view is it doesn't make sense for the economy to preemptively cut off all of that economic activity for a potential future. It's more about thinking about how you would transition if things get worse than sort of the recent droughts of record and in
Right.
sort of
It's just that
forecast.
when you usually read a lot of these water supply reports, they're unrealistic and actually make the situation worse if we're going to address a 5-year drought or a 6-year drought. Because just like you said, we know we can have a 9-year drought or a 12-year drought. What I think is really important is up front, you point out, if this goes beyond what we're designing for, here's how we're going to address it. These are the cuts. These are the demand modifications that will need to be made in order to make this system continue to operate under these beyond design conditions. And that's missing in a lot of the reports. So I just comment there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from other board members? Okay. Just wanted to remind you all, we have 5 more speakers, but we're going to stay. We really appreciate all of your comments.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ellen. I just wanted to remind folks, we have some extra copies out in the front for those who'd like it. And also ppic.org/water. You can find some information there. ppic.org, yeah. And then,
Us guys appreciate that.
yes.
Yes.
And gals. Moving on with our presenters, Aisha Massel with American Rivers.
Good morning. My name is Aisha Massel. I'm with American Rivers, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Waiting for the presentation to load. I would like to present to you a vision of how floodplains can serve as a cornerstone of California's sustainable water future. Now, we all know the governor issued an executive order in late April of this year that I think is actually quite visionary in some of its statements. Paraphrasing some of what he said, that water is a human right, that climate change is coming, population is increasing, and with all of this, the economy must remain healthy. He further ordered some state agencies to prepare a water resilience portfolio using a bunch of principles. I called out just a few here, including strengthening partnerships, using natural infrastructure, and utilizing the multi-benefit approach. Now, we really have an opportunity to reach across our various disciplines and our jurisdictions to integrate our work and create a sustainable water future. And I'll show you some examples of how I think we can do that. Not just me, a bunch of people have been thinking about this a lot. So here we have the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which, as we all know, is primarily focused with flood risk reduction efforts. More recently, the board has really embraced the strategy of the multi-benefit approach via the conservation strategy. And so I think that this entity here is really leading the way forward, and we need to do more of this type of integrative thinking as we move forward in the century. Yeah, so the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is a huge piece of legislation. There's a lot of work being done, and we can really influence it to be multi-benefit as well, and not just single purpose. And of course, we have the Water Board's basin plans, which are often focused on flow criteria and water quality improvements. And this is really focusing more on surface water, also to some degree groundwater as well. And so we have these 3 different policies that one is dealing with flood risk reduction, the other one is dealing with groundwater management, and the other one is dealing with surface waters. So how can we integrate these different policy objectives? Well, I propose that we think about floodplains. Now, floodplains are truly the poster child for multi-benefit projects. These are just some of the benefits that I can see. There's flood risk reduction. We know that giving rivers room actually protects communities. We also well established that floodplains provide incredible ecosystem benefits for aquatic, terrestrial, and avian species. The groundwater potential, the groundwater recharge potential of floodplains is also a very interesting topic. It's something I've delved into this past year. And I would say that I think there's great potential here. It's just that it's very site specific. So we need to do our due diligence to really find out if a floodplain is suitable for groundwater recharge, just like any other recharge basin. The water quality benefits of floodplains, we know that vegetation takes up nitrates, and also a variety of wetlands processes helps to remove contaminants. Now, in looking at reservoir operations flexibility, what we know is that if we increase the capacity of the downstream river to take on more water, then reservoir operations have improved flexibility to release larger flows without threatening downstream communities. So that's also a huge benefit, I believe, for floodplain expansion. Now, this next bullet is no changes to water rights. That's really in the context of floodplains as recharge sites. So, a lot of the effort in thinking of groundwater recharge lately has focused on managed aquifer recharge on agricultural lands, which can often be very far away from the river. And so there's some controversy about taking some of that peak flow and moving it off the channel. You have to think about beneficial uses. Is that a beneficial use? And also think about flow criteria. And so the benefit of thinking of floodplain recharge sites as a recharge site, is that there are no conflicts with either of those, either the flow criteria or the beneficial uses. And of course, riparian forests have tremendous potential to capture literally tons of carbon. And floodplains are also very beautiful places, teeming with life, that give communities a beautiful place to visit. So I would say that in our approach, when we're thinking about a sustainable water future, that we should think of floodplains first. Definitely not floodplains only, because there is no silver bullet to California water management. But they are an essential piece, and because of the many benefits that they have. And floodplains also present unique opportunities for synergies between different policy objectives, and I'll get into that. This is really touching on the flood study group's recommendations, and this is outlined in great detail in the document that we've sent out, and I encourage you to really look in that document. I think there's a lot of really good suggestions. So just a few of them. How does the flood protection plan really integrate with SGMA? Well, we think that the update in 2022 should include new policies such as milestones and timelines to create floodplain habitat, either by REACH, by river basin, or by SGMA groundwater basin. The board can also really take a look at financial incentives to integrate floodplain expansion and SGMA implementation. There's a lot of ways to stack benefits such as carbon sequestration funding. There's also an emerging groundwater market. We should think about this and how to fund these projects. And also think about incentives to expand floodplains in rural areas where the levees are inadequate. So rather than spend money on fixing a levee, think about how we can really use floodplains in its place while protecting communities. The flood protection plan can also integrate well with the water board basin plans. So we think that the State Water Board should include an analysis of how flow requirements really interact with floodplain activation. And specifically, flow criteria could be timed to support the habitat needs of various aquatic species particularly, and also placed in river reaches where there's groundwater potential. So there's a lot of integration potential here. The flood protection plan should also include some land use considerations. We know that preventing unsafe development on floodplains is the most effective way to reduce future flood risk. And this is a photo of the 1997 Manteca flood. We want to avoid future scenarios like this. And some of our recommendations include requiring a 200-year protection for urban areas, limit or even prevent development on undeveloped floodplains, and to evaluate the flood protection determinations made by local agencies. Now, this last part is really just acknowledging that determining flood risk takes a lot of engineering analysis and climate risk modeling to really understand it, and just make sure that the board agrees with the determinations in order to protect communities. And finally, we know that a lot of acres of agricultural land will need to be retired under SGMA. PPIC has estimated up to 780,000 acres that must be retired. And now this can happen in a very uncoordinated fashion with potential for a lot of nuisance, such as dust and weeds and economic kind of abandonment of areas. But if we take an integrated land retirement approach, maybe we can create something much better than even what we have now. And I would say land retirement, an integrated vision would include the following: improve flood management, prohibit development on retired agricultural land in floodplains, restore habitats, corridors, and floodplains. So instead of having patchworks of restoration areas, mitigation banks, et cetera, we can look at corridors that really allow species to move with the seasons and with climate change. We can prioritize groundwater recharge opportunities that have multiple benefits. We can improve and protect surface and groundwater quality. This is essential for continuing life, good quality of life in the Central Valley. And a couple of other things just to put out there as ideas is that we can use green infrastructure as a basis for a replacement economy in impacted regions. Like I said before, there's going to be a lot of changes with SGMA, with the land retirement, and we want to make sure that the communities are supported and have an economic basis. There's ecotourism that some people have brought up, but I would really bring up that using riparian forests as carbon sequestration sinks are really potentially a very powerful way forward. There's a recent report that planting trees is the single most beneficial way to sequester carbon, and it also happens to be the cheapest. And so, in conclusion, I would just like to present this artistic rendering that was presented in a Delta Renewed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And it shows a way forward where, we're not advocating for the dissolution of agriculture, but agriculture can live in balance with floodplains and river systems, while those floodplain systems really provide so many benefits to us as a society and as a culture. And I would just say that thinking of floodplains, we can really have it be a cornerstone of a sustainable water future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments and remarks. Very intriguing.
Thank you, Isha. Next, we're going to continue with the river theme. Julie Rentner with River Partners, I believe is here. Hi.
Morning.
Good morning. Hello. So Julie Rentner with River Partners. Good morning, Vice President Dolan and members of the board. Good to see you all. It's my pleasure to be here today. On behalf of River Partners, to talk to you about your efforts that advance Governor Newsom's water resilience portfolio. I brought some beautiful pictures to share. My organization has this unique position, as you all know, being a river conservation and a non-governmental organization that delivers large-scale habitat restoration, and we've been doing it for 20 years in the Central Valley from Redding to Bakersfield. But we're also a farm manager. We produce silage and alfalfa and heifers and almonds on over 1,000 acres in the Central Valley. True. We're also a permittee of this board and every other agency that has something to do with managing water in California. We're a project and research financer for multi-million-dollar projects that touch water in many ways. We're the majority landowner, and I'm the president of Reclamation District 2092, a 2,000-acre reclamation district that deals with all of the same challenges and opportunities of the LMAs across the Central Valley of your jurisdiction. We're also an active member of the flood planning community. We led the development of the Mid-San Joaquin Regional Flood Management Plan. Lots of friends in that photo. And we're a contractor and a grantee with just about every agency that uses public money to do flood system improvements in the Central Valley. So I'm delighted to have your ears today to share with you my appreciation for this board's leadership in all of this work, my enthusiasm for the future of flood management in the Central Valley, and then some of my on-the-ground perspectives about things that we could improve upon to do a better job. This board is the state's water resilience planning leaders. You've done a tremendous job in the last 13, 14 years now, thinking forward. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is the heart of California's water management future, and it's the model that other planning efforts need to advance the governor's water resilience portfolio. Thanks to your leadership and the hardworking staff at DWR and the board staff here, and meaningful engagement from a broad variety of stakeholders across the Central Valley, the flood management community already has a broadly supported plan for advancing the governor's resilience portfolio. And I hope you agree with me that as a community, our task will be working together to get the CVFPP fully funded and implemented. That's our work. I'm not going to use my limited time today to preach to the choir, but I will soon have a blog post up on River Partners blog, River Shift, describing specifically how the flood plan addresses all of the governor's resilience portfolio principles. And I think that that articulation will be helpful in securing funds for full implementation of the CVFPP. So, as everybody has talked about this morning already, I'm concerned about the San Joaquin. This is my first major point. We have this growing population driven by this record-breaking housing boom statewide in the South Delta, and that most productive agricultural region in the world, all around the San Joaquin Valley, and it's suffering from unsustainable water use, which is prompting us to take a serious look at widespread land retirement or changes in the way we move water. The San Joaquin system of levees were designed long ago to accommodate smaller floods, and they've had a legacy of O&M challenges. They have and they continue to contribute to wildlife population declines that are so severe they make national headlines. Where groundwater overdraft has been particularly severe, land subsidence threatens the continued operation of all of our water infrastructure here. We all know that the climate projections, like we heard from Ellen earlier, for the San Joaquin watershed, they're extreme. And the climate analysis that this group prepared for the 2017 update projects that the frequency and magnitude of large floods will increase for a 200-year event, double the 97 event. The 97 event's the flood of record. It overwhelmed the system from top to bottom. That's a pretty devastating increase in magnitude. But the projections also say a lot about smaller, more frequent flood events as well. By the year 2085, the 10-year flood event is projected to increase by 30 to 50%. So that's a considerable increase in a flood that we see regularly, that we've seen a couple times in just the last few years. At the same time that this flooding is intensifying, our water storage capacity and the snowpack is diminishing. And these changes are happening right now. So we need to move really quickly to manage this growing risk. Simply patching up the existing levee system or increasing our enforcement of unpermitted encroachments is not going to be sufficient to address this problem. In fact, it might even be counterproductive to resilience planning. Familiar? So here's some good news. The 2017 plan emphasizes implementation of multi-benefit projects as a cornerstone of flood safety, and the San Joaquin has some real examples of model projects which can give us lessons learned about how to do a better job tackling these problems. The Dutch water ambassador, Henk Ovink. One of my favorite quotes from his 60 Minutes interview was about how he was asked about how flood management challenges in the U.S. are addressed, and he said, yeah, when things happen, you come together and you want to build back and repair and be ready for the next disaster, but there's not so much a belief that you can actually prevent a disaster from happening. I think we need to think differently for the San Joaquin in light of that perspective. So, bringing the levees of the rural San Joaquin into compliance with PL 8499 standards, that might help to get federal funds to rebuild the levees after a flood. But why would we want to rebuild a system that's too small to accommodate what's coming? Trying to patch up the failing system is going to divert time and resources away from finding a long-term solution that's consistent with the governor's resilience principles. Along many reaches of San Joaquin River, it's time to work with willing landowners and land managers to strategically set back or abandon obsolete reaches of the levee system to reduce flood damages in the future. And that might sound like a politically impossible task, but it's already happening. As you know, the Three Amigos site in 2017, the levee was breached, reconnecting 2,000 acres of floodplain as a component of the nation's first non-structural alternative flood control project. That transitory storage basin at the Three Amigos site effectively slowed the flood peak as far as 13 miles downriver. You can see this image on River Partners blog post, or we can talk more about it if you're interested, but it's an illustration of the actual hydrology right after the levee breached in an unplanned location at the Three Amigos site in 2017. At Dos Rios Ranch, where you visited in October of last year, we are well on our way to restoring 2,000 acres of floodplain habitat, and we hope to eventually reconnect the levees, our levee-protected lands back to the floodway. But that change is going to require changing the project purpose for a portion of the federal flood control project, and we still don't have a clear pathway to do that. Upstream at Great Valley Grassland State Park, we're working with American Rivers, California State Parks, and the Lower San Joaquin Levee District to abandon and decommission more than 2 miles of an unnecessary levee that will reconnect high-value floodplain habitat to benefit salmon. And downstream of all of this, in the Delta at Paradise Cut, American Rivers and local partners are working with the San Joaquin Resource Conservation District to expand the bypass at Paradise Cut, which might add about 2,000 acres of floodplain to the floodway. So as Aisha adequately, beautifully described a moment ago, expanding the floodway lowers the probability of levee failure and produces a host of other benefits, like groundwater recharge, improved water quality, upstream reservoir management flexibility. It provides open space and recreation opportunities for a growing population, which I think we don't talk enough about. And of course, habitat restoration supporting wildlife population recovery, which in the long run diminishes regulatory conflict. The River Partners did we ran some numbers using the Water Storage Investment Program's valuation methodology. We calculated the economic benefits of our work on floodplains, and we learned that there's about a 21-to-1 return on investment. You can read the details in the Rivershift blog, but a new vision for flood management in San Joaquin could not only save taxpayers hundreds of millions in avoided levee maintenance and liability costs, but more significantly, it could provide hundreds of millions more in ecological services ranging from fisheries restoration to pollination habitat. So, the flood plan prioritizes multi-benefit projects. Innovations in permitting and funding are actually needed to increase the pace and scale of what we're showing we can already do. Even for projects that have no opposition, they take too long to respond to the changing climate. So we've lived through the portfolio approach to funding for some of the projects we've worked on throughout the Central Valley over the last 20 years, and I have some real recommendations to share with you today, and I'll delve deeper with them if you like, regarding permitting and funding. So this is what a portfolio approach to financing looks like if you're a not-for-profit organization. This is the Three Amigos project working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to secure over time $52 million. And where the sources of those funds came from. It's important to note that over $50 million of what you're seeing here was won through competitive processes, which means writing grant proposals, advocating for projects, developing political support, finally executing agreements. This process takes a really long time. And if we walk through this process for every flood system improvement we want to do, it's going to take much too long. At the Dos Rios project, similar outcomes. We had to amend the purchase agreement with that willing landowner over 20 times just to meet the varying and often conflicting conditions for all of the different funding programs, 11 different funding programs over the course of 10 years, just to buy the property. That's not going to work moving forward. So I asked the Flood Board to support the development of better strategies to fund multi-benefit projects and the full implementation of the flood protection plan. Some of those include seeking consistency in contracting terms across all of the funding programs that the state controls in the umbrella of this California Natural Resources Agency. This board can support efforts to try to bring those programs into alignment. We need to broaden the pool of project sponsors, broaden the suite of public agencies and other partners that DWR can work directly with to fund multi-benefit projects to speed up that process of funding